Okay, this video is about how the burden of proof is on other people. Okay? And it can't be met because I'm obviously right. The burden of proof is on them to show that I am not ideal, but I am. How can they show that? Number one, in a Judeo-Christian culture historically, where nobody, not even people from other religions, have ever presented a logical, viable counterargument to the idea that someone who is poor, who's willing to die for what he believes, who strikes a spiritual blow, a blow in principle. For those of you who don't believe in spirit and you think school spirits don't exist, etc., a blow in principle isn't ideal, isn't greater than a mere craftsman, a mere president, a mere rich person. No one in history has ever presented a single argument that would argue that the real life version of someone who is poor, who dies for what he believes, lives and dies for what he believes, and who strikes a blow in principle, in martial principle, okay, isn't the ideal, because that type of person is the ideal. Now, let's think about it in its real life context. Is Prince Humperdinck from The Princess Bride, or or some European noble, so to speak, the ideal? No, because they're not poor. They have ill-gotten gains. If you have ill-gotten gains, if you're rich, right, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into heaven. If you're rich, you are not ideal. You are hoarding ill-gotten gains. You're hoarding trickle-down blood money in a system that isn't fair. If you manage to make a bunch of money in a system that is not fair, is not universally and logically fair, then you're just a no-good cheat. Pretty straightforward, right? So the ideal person must be poor, at least for much of his life. Bare minimum requirement. One of the bare minimum requirements. Okay? All right. So he's poor, and he's a martial artist. Why? Because at the end of the Bible, Christ comes back on a horse, leading the charge. Well, who rode horses and who didn't? The neocolonialists rode the horse. So he wouldn't actually come on a horse. The Romans, the neocolonialists, the people riding horses, typically speaking, basically are not righteous people. They're privileged people who could afford a horse. And they say, look at my privilege, and I'm not going to fight you man to man, and I'm going to strike down as I ride by on a horse and hope that you aren't good enough to strike me down. They leveraging privilege and ill-gotten gains. Pretty straightforward. Name a time in history where that wasn't the case. Name a war in history. When the French fought the English, there's a bunch of privileged people fighting each other. And the more privileged, generally speaking, had the horses, right? Pretty straightforward. So we can cross that out as a Western idea, because we can't cite a single white Westerner who struck a blow in principle, okay, that is believable and reliable. Not a single one. Not even Abraham Lincoln. When you do your research, he was actually just a racist guy who was just politicking, in a nutshell, is the logical assumption. And he certainly wasn't a martial artist. So we can't point to a single one of them. So where are we going to look? We're going to look to the African, we're going to look to the Asian, maybe to the Native American, maybe to the Hispanic, maybe to the Semite. But we got to look at ideal. The ideal man is either black or mulatto, mixed black. A martial artist who was poor most of his life in terms of what he owns. Doesn't matter what my parents own, we know what I own. I didn't start driving until I was 19 years old. And I started off with driving a used car. I've never purchased a brand new car in my life, and no one has ever purchased a brand new car for me in my life. Ever. Okay? And we see the martial connection because Exodus 15:3 says the Lord is a warrior, and Jesus comes back in his glory as a warrior. Does he come back as a craftsman? No. As a scientist? No. As a magician doing magic tricks? No. As a mere poet? No. As a mere scribe? No. His spirit comes back as a warrior, so it's that warrior spirit that vindicates him. Not his claims of being the Son of God. It's his victory in principle that is depicted deliberately as a warrior depiction. Now, of the warriors, there's a warrior order. Is Genghis Khan the same as the most noble warrior that ever lived? No. Is some privileged colonialist the same as the most noble warrior that ever lived? No. When it comes to focused moral intensity, focused noble intensity, universal pinpoint and moral precision, we see historically that the black man goes beyond. And he also goes beyond other black people like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. He goes beyond that. Does a martial artist who pinpoints the spirit of righteousness and conveys it better than anyone else that ever lived, the ideal man? Yes. And the burden of proof is not on me, because I have a 9-year up to $10 million challenge that these people fled from and resorted to hiding in their ignoble cultures instead of accepting my challenge or conceding my point. The burden of proof is then on them. It's on everyone who doesn't obey God through me, because by their actions they're arguing that I'm not God's son. By their actions they're arguing that I'm not the ideal, the guy who should lead, the guy who knows better than them and the people leading them. So therefore the burden of proof is on them to show that they're not fucking idiots. And if they have families, on them to show that they're not idiots who are training their offspring to be idiots and leading them to be idiots. The burden of proof is on them. Thank you.